Welcome to the debate. Usually, when we map out physical territory, there is a profound comfort in borders. You step across a line drawn on a map, and you are definitively in one country or another. It's binary, you know?
Right. You're either in France or you're in Germany.
Exactly. The distinction is clean.
The boundary is absolute. It is measurable, it's legally defined, and, human beings naturally crave that kind of structural clarity when we're trying to make sense of complex systems.
But then you step off the map and look at the actual terrain. You look at a river that forms that border, and the water is flowing, shifting, constantly eroding the banks.
Yeah.
And suddenly, that hard conceptual line doesn't perfectly capture the physical reality of the ground beneath your feet. Today, we are exploring that exact tension, not in cartography, but in economic systems.
We are examining whether a genuine third-way economic system actually exists between the hard borders of capitalism and socialism.
Right.
Specifically, we are looking at distributism. This is a framework championed heavily by early 20th century Catholic thinkers like Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton. Fundamentally, distributism seeks to avoid both the sweeping, totalitarian control of state socialism and the highly concentrated corporate wealth of pure capitalism.
And if you're listening to this and thinking, wait, isn't distributism just socialism in a vintage wrapper? Well, you aren't alone.
Right. That is exactly the tension we are dissecting today.
And our discourse emerges directly from the arguments laid out in an essay titled A Libertarian Critique of Pure Distributism. I will be arguing that economics exists on a strict linear dichotomy between private and state ownership. Because of that reality, distributism is fundamentally an illusion. Any restriction placed on property control by the state it's merely a slide towards socialism, no matter what you call it.
And I will argue, drawing on the distributist critiques within our text, that ownership and control are entirely distinct concepts. Separating them allows for a necessary third way, a system that prevents the structural inequality and absolute wage dependence that are inherently baked into pure capitalism.
So to begin, we really have to look at how we are mapping this economic territory in the first place. I firmly maintain that capitalism and socialism exist on a single linear axis.
Okay, a single axis.
Yeah. On the far right of this spectrum, you have the pure non-aggression principle. That is the basic right to simply be left alone, to not be hit, and to not have your property interfered with by force.
Right.
On the far left of the spectrum, you have absolute totalitarianism, where the state controls everything. If you look at something like the Heritage Freedom Index, which is essentially a scale measuring how little a government interferes with your wallet and your business operations, you can actually plot nations along this very line.
Mm-hmm.
You go from the highly restricted state-run economy of North Korea to the incredibly free private markets of Singapore.
And the definitions seem pretty straightforward when you look at it that way.
Exactly. When we use modern working definitions, the distinction is perfectly clear. Capitalism is an environment where investment and the ownership of the means of production, the factories, the servers, the tools, are maintained chiefly by private individuals.
Right, and socialism is when that ownership and the control of those assets falls to the community, usually manifested through a centralized government.
It is a sliding scale. The more the government controls, the more socialist you are.
Well, I come at it from a different way because I think that single-access binary is incredibly reductive. It completely flattens the complexity of human organization.
How so?
If we look at the distributist framework presented by the philosopher John Kleve, he effectively argues that this binary fails entirely. It fails because it conflates two things that can and historically have been separated. That is the ownership of production and the control of production.
But how are you separating those in practice?
Let's look at the mechanics of history. Kleve points out that we have seen massive hybrid systems. Take fascism in the early 20th century. Under that system, you had individual ownership on paper. You held the title deed to your factory.
Sure.
But the state exerted ultimate control over how that property was used. A government minister dictated your production quotas, set your prices, and determined your suppliers. Your ownership was private, but control was public.
Okay, but...
Wait, and feudalism flipped that mechanic entirely. The state or the crown technically owned the land, they held the ultimate deed,
but the individual vassal or local lord controlled the daily means of production.
Right.
They decided what crops to plant, how to run the mill, and reaped the daily operational benefits. So the idea that ownership and control are the exact same thing just doesn't hold up to historical scrutiny. They are distinct levers.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. I would argue that those historical examples actually prove my point. Ownership and control are inextricably linked in any meaningful sense. You only truly own property to the extent that you actually control it.
I don't follow.
Well, in your fascism example, if the state tells you exactly what you must do with your factory, whom you must hire, and what you must produce, your ownership is just a piece of paper. It is a legal fiction. You are essentially a middle manager for the state.
But the title?
The title means nothing if the agency is gone. Therefore, any limit placed on property control by a centralized authority beyond the basic non-aggression principle of not actively harming someone is a violation of negative rights.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning, it violates your inherent right to be left alone to use your property as you see fit. That interference is inherently socialistic.
That is a compelling argument, I'll admit. But have you considered the moral dimension introduced by Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen? Distributism relies heavily on his specific distinction that the ownership of property is fundamentally personal, but the use of property is inherently social.
Okay, so it's a moral claim.
Yes, and it addresses a real structural problem. G.K. Chesterton defined pure capitalism as a condition where capital is so intensely concentrated into a relatively small class that it necessitates a very large majority of citizens serving those capitalists simply for a wage.
Which is a natural outcome of free markets.
But pure capitalism inevitably drives toward that concentration. Therefore, a third way, distributism, is not only conceptually valid because ownership and use can be separated, but it is morally necessary to address the systemic failings of a purely binary capitalist system.
Well, let's dive right into that conceptual separation, because to determine if distributism is a valid third way, we first have to establish if it is logically sound to separate owning a piece of property from controlling how it is used. You mentioned Archbishop Fulton Sheen, and he has a very famous, very specific analogy to make this point.
Yes, Sheen's gun analogy. It is a brilliant distillation of the distributist mindset. Sheen argues that you may legitimately own a gun. You bought it. You hold the receipt. The state recognizes your personal ownership of that physical object.
Right.
However, society naturally and rightfully places restrictions on your use of that private property. You are not permitted to use that gun to kill your mother-in-law.
Thankfully.
Exactly. And the restriction on the use of the object does not negate your ownership of it. You still own the gun. Therefore, society can and does regulate the social use of private property without slipping into totalitarian socialism. It proves the third way is entirely possible.
I have to stop you there, because the gun analogy actually proves the exact opposite of what the distributists wanted to prove.
Wait, how so? It clearly separates ownership from use.
Because telling someone they cannot commit murder is not a social restriction on economics. It is simply the non-aggression principle in action. A functioning system must prohibit the violation of another person's negative rights, their right to life, liberty, and property. This is necessary in order to maximize freedom for everyone.
But you're still restricting what they can do.
Sure, but the rule in shooting your mother-in-law isn't a limitation on your economic property rights. It's a protection of her fundamental right to life.
But it is still a restriction on control. You cannot do whatever you want with your property.
There is a massive categorical difference between preventing direct physical harm and a state dictating the internal operations of a business. Let me offer a different analogy. Imagine I own a printing press.
Okay, a printing press.
The non-aggression principle says I cannot use my printing press to physically drop it on someone's head. That is basic universal justice.
Right.
But if the state steps in and says, you own the printing press, but you can only print 500 books a week so that your competitor down the street gets a fair share of the market, well, that is entirely different.
Because they're managing the economy?
They're controlling the economic mechanism itself. St. Augustine once noted, justice being taken away, then, what are kingdoms but great robberies?
When the state imposes control beyond preventing direct harm, when it starts engineering market outcomes, it hollows out your ownership until it is nothing more than state robbery.
I hear the printing press analogy, but I think it fundamentally ignores the social reality of what capital does when it accumulates over time. You are framing any state intervention as a robbery of the individual owner.
Because it is.
But the distributist looks at the landscape and asks, what happens when the absolute lack of restrictions allows one person to buy up all the printing presses?
What happens is that they have succeeded in the market. They have provided a product people wanted.
But look at what happens when that wealth scales up. Suddenly, it's not just a guy with a successful printing shop, it's a massive power disparity. And that changes the entire nature of society. If, as you suggest, pure private control must be maintained without any distributist limits, we have to address the direct consequence of that absolute freedom.
You mean inequality?
Yes, the rise of stark, systemic inequality. Belloc and Chesterton aren't condemning natural differences in human skill. They are condemning a structural environment. We aren't just talking about 1920s factories here. Think about a modern Amazon fulfillment center or a sprawling data entry cubicle farm.
Okay.
Belloc argued that industrial capitalism makes the end of man simply the accumulation of wealth, and it turns labor itself into an inhuman repetition without interest and without savor. Think of the workers scanning barcodes for 10 hours a day, their bathroom breaks timed by an algorithm.
Right.
They own nothing of the facility. They are merely renting their physical motion to a massive corporation for a wage. That is what Chesterton meant when he said a very large majority are forced to serve a tiny class of capitalists.
That's an evocative image, though I would frame the underlying economics very differently. The assumption you are making is that inequality itself is inherently immoral or structurally flawed.
It leads to structural flaws, yes.
But inequality is not only inevitable in a free society, it is natural and beneficial. Pope Leo XIII addressed this directly in his landmark encyclical Rerum Novarum. He wrote that there naturally exist among mankind manifold differences. People differ in capacity, skill, health, and strength.
Right, nobody denies that.
Therefore, unequal fortune is a necessary result of unequal condition. And he specifically noted that this inequality is far from disadvantageous to either individuals or the community.
But Belloc isn't talking about one person being a slightly faster worker than another. He is talking about a system where the masses own absolutely no productive property of their own.
Yet an economy that is structurally restricted from producing inequality, which is exactly what distributism attempts to do by limiting capital concentration, is an economy that becomes stifled. It fails to produce enough for all the people, and everyone suffers, most notably the poor.
I disagree that it fails to produce enough.
Consider Margaret Thatcher's famous defense of free markets in the 1980s. She looked at the socialist critiques of her policies and observed that all income levels were empirically better off than they had been. Her critique of the left was that they would rather the poor be poorer, provided the rich were less rich. Forcing economic equality among naturally unequal participants is inherently unjust.
Okay, I have to jump in here because you are equating distributism with forced state egalitarianism, like a Marxist redistribution where everyone gets the exact same paycheck.
Well, functionally,
But distributors don't want everyone to have the exact same amount of money. Distributism loves private property. They love it so much they want everyone to have it. They want the means of production to be widely distributed so that families can be self-sufficient rather than entirely dependent on a monolithic corporate employer for their survival.
But how do you prevent concentration without penalizing virtue? Let's use a hypothetical to really drill down into how this works on the ground. Think about two hypothetical workers. Let's call them Fred and John.
Okay, Fred and John.
They both make widgets, and they both earn $50,000 a year working for the same boutique company. John decides to spend his money extravagantly. He leases a sports car, he buys the newest phone every year, he takes expensive vacations.
A consumer.
Exactly. He consumes. He has nothing to show for at the end of the year. Fred, however, makes a different moral choice. Fred packs his lunch. He drives a 10-year-old sedan. He lives frugally, he sacrifices, and he saves $20,000 annually.
Okay, so Fred is practicing the classic virtue of thrift.
Right. Now fast forward 5 years. John is broke, but Fred has stored $100,000 in capital. Fred then uses that stored wealth to buy the widget company they both work for. Now there's massive economic inequality between Fred and John. John now works for Fred.
I see where this is going.
The distributist looks at that dynamic and sees a problem of capital concentration. John might complain it isn't fair that Fred has so much money and power over his daily schedule. But this inequality is an immoral flaw of capitalism. It is the moral reward for frugality. If you penalize Fred to prevent him from owning the company, if you enforce a distributist limit on his capital accumulation, you're actually punishing virtue and encouraging John's wasteful consumerism.
That is a very neat, clean hypothetical. It maps perfectly to a microeconomic interaction. But the reality of the terrain is that the accumulation of wealth by figures like Fred doesn't stop at one small widget company.
Meaning what?
It eventually scales up into something far more abstract and powerful. This brings us directly to the question of what happens to the employer-employee relationship once capital is massively concentrated. Is it mutually beneficial, or does it become inherently exploitative?
I completely reject the exploitation framing. It ignores the fundamental mechanics of business. Labor without capital is just slavery. You need capital to build the infrastructure for labor to be productive in the first place.
Let me finish the thought on exploitation, though, because Fulton Sheen had a profound critique of modern finance capitalism that addresses exactly this.
Go ahead.
He argued that since the advent of advanced finance and massive stock markets, capitalism allows for the complete separation of responsibility from ownership. Think about modern board members or passive shareholders.
Sure.
They sit back, own the means of production, and profit off the labor of others without actually touching a product or working to produce the wealth themselves. The power dynamic becomes incredibly skewed. The employee is entirely at the mercy of the owner's pursuit of profit. It treats the worker as merely an input cost on a spreadsheet, rather than a human being bringing value to the table.
Or value the capital itself. They bring the money to pay the wages before a single product is even sold to a customer.
Yes, but
More importantly, the capitalist assumes all the financial risk. Let's go back to Fred. If Fred's newly purchased widget company goes bankrupt because consumer tastes change, the employees aren't on the hook for that loss.
true.
They take their last paycheck and they look for another job. Fred carries the debt, he loses his $100,000. That risk is exactly what entitles the owner to the profit. It is a voluntarily agreed upon employment contract, which makes it mutually beneficial.
I acknowledge the reality of financial risk. I really do. But just because an employee can walk away from a bankrupt company doesn't mean the traditional corporate hierarchy is the most just way to organize human labor.
What's the alternative then?
There are other ways to structure risk. Look at cooperatives or employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs. These are entirely acceptable within a free market. In these models, the workers actually own shares of the company. If the company profits, the workers see the dividend. If it fails, they share the risk. It distributes the property and the responsibility perfectly, which is exactly what the distributists advocate.
And yet, cooperatives are incredibly rare in the broader market.
Yes, but we have to ask why they're rare. It isn't because of some grand conspiracy against cooperatives, but simply because creating a company by committee is logistically incredibly difficult.
Exactly.
You have to get dozens of people to agree on a direction. Traditional hierarchies dominate because they are easier to form and manage, not necessarily because they represent the highest moral ideal of human flourishing. If we value the dignity of labor, as Belloc did, we should desire an economic culture that works to elevate the worker to an owner rather than settling for the easiest, most top-down managerial structure.
That's an interesting point, though. I would argue that modern capitalism is actually solving the distributist dilemma right now, entirely on its own through technology.
You mean the gig economy?
Precisely. Let's really look at what services like Uber, TaskRabbit, or Airbnb actually do mechanically. They allow independent contractors to rent their own property, their car, their tools, their spare bedroom, and sell their own skills directly to the market.
Right, it's decentralized.
Let's take an Uber driver. They own the car, they are deploying their own capital, they don't have a manager telling them when to clock in. If they want to earn more, they turn on the app and drive more. They absorb the depreciation of their asset and they take the direct profit. This effectively dismantles the entire Marxist and distributist dichotomy of the oppressive capital owner versus the oppressed wage worker. Through free market technological innovation, the owner and the worker have increasingly become the exact same person. It proves that the free market, left to its own devices, provides the tools for distributed ownership far better than any top-down, state-mandated system could.
Okay, I'll admit the gig economy throws a fascinating wrench into this. I concede that it provides a glimpse of what decentralized microcapitalism can look like. It is a brilliant innovation.
Thank you.
But if we look closer at those platforms, we have to look at the broader summary of what we've discussed today. The critiques raised by Chesterton and Belloc remain deeply relevant. Pure capitalism still carries a gravitational pull toward the concentration of capital. We may have independent Uber drivers, but who owns the algorithm?
Well, the tech company.
Exactly. We have monolithic tech companies that control the very platforms those independent drivers rely on for their survival. If the algorithm changes your pay rate overnight, how much control do you really have? The fundamental distributist insight is that true freedom requires a broader, structural distribution of productive property. It is not enough to simply have a hands-off state. We need an economic ethos that provides a necessary check on capitalist excesses and prevents the vast majority of people from being reduced to mere cogs in a machine they do not own.
And I would summarize by returning to the core mechanics of the free market. Capitalism, rooted in the non-aggression principle and absolute private property rights, remains the most viable and moral system we have for lifting people out of poverty. Distributist attempts to forcefully limit capital accumulation inevitably require a central authority to enforce those limits, which is a slide towards socialist control.
Even if they deny it.
Exactly. Furthermore, capital itself, stored wealth, is a moral good. People often misquote the book of 1 Timothy, saying that money is the root of all evil. The actual quote is that the love of money is the root of all evil. Money itself is a morally neutral means of exchange.
Right.
And as the biblical parable of the talents so perfectly illustrates, investing and growing stored wealth, taking a risk in the market rather than squandering it or letting it sit idle, is just necessary and vital for the flourishing of human society.
There is an enduring tension here. We are constantly balancing the right to unrestricted private property against the profound moral desire for an economy that prevents vast systemic disparities in power.
Exactly. And examining whether absolute economic freedom inherently requires limits to protect human dignity is a question that requires us to look very closely at the terrain beneath our feet, rather than just trusting the conceptual borders drawn on a map.
There is much more to explore in the historical texts and modern applications of these theories, and we encourage everyone to delve into the arguments and form their own conclusions.
Because once you step out of the simple binary, the landscape of human exchange becomes much more complex.
And much more fascinating.
Thank you for joining us. We leave you with this thought. If the map of our economy only offers two directions, are we brave enough to chart the river that flows between them?